shit about the university. It's probably like one of my favorite hobbies. Um, but it's more fun to do with a group, right? So I've got some PowerPoints here, and I'm gonna try to make it as brief as I can, but it's a long talk that I really tried to chop down. But yeah. Okay. You know, I always forget you can hit the present thing. I totally never do that with my students when I'm teaching. Okay. So yeah, so I give numerous versions of this, but I you know, sometimes I emphasize like a history of the student movement. Sometimes I emphasize just stuff about what's going on with like, you know, executive pay and tuition and stuff like that. Trying to give a more sort of holistic version of this. So I'm gonna I cut down on some parts of it. So, you know, hopefully we'll have a really fruitful discussion that can fill in some of those gaps. So this is something that I often give to undergrads. So apologies if some of this is like a little too basic, like what is neoliberalism? But given that it's being recorded and we don't know who's listening, I feel like it or is going to listen. I'll just kind of start off with the basic stuff. So neoliberalism is often talked about as a return to free market policies. And this includes things like privatization, austerity, tax cuts, and deregulation. However, David Harvey points out that the reality is that neoliberalism has been backed by state violence and increasing state power, and that neoliberalism is better understood as, quote, a political project to establish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. And so it's really less about markets and more about, you know, the power of capitalists and, you know, increasing profits. And so that's the sort of, you know, foundation that I'm working with here. So when I say the neoliberalization of the UC, I think it's best understood as something that's happening both within the university and to the university, right? So it's sort of changes that are happening within the university, but also the sort of relationships it's enmeshed up in. So as far as austerity goes, things like the state of California cutting funding to higher education definitely plays a role in this. But this is the only part of the equation that UC admin wants you to focus on because it shifts all of the blame and all of the focus just to Sacramento, right? So at some point years ago, when students were fighting a potential tuition hike, Chancellor Katehi, the former chancellor now at UC Davis, actually was like, you know what? I support you. We need more funding. I don't want there to be a tuition hike either. I'll get a bus and I'll send you all to Sacramento so you can go and tell them that we need more money, right? So like they love to just talk about that, but that's not the whole picture. And so as much as I'll mention that, there's so much more to this. So whenever somebody's only talking about funding the UC, you know, be careful because that can very much lead you to sort of being a tool of admin, whether you intend to or not, is what I always tell undergrads. Like we need to take a bigger picture here. So privatization is things like increasing tuition shifts in higher education in California from a publicly funded good to a privately funded consumer choice. And the privatization of campus services. So like housing, for example, right? A lot of housing in UC Davis is, you know, operated by private companies, despite the fact that, you know, the campus could oversee that itself, right? And cut out the middleman that's making profit. And so students could be paying less. So things like that. And there's some stuff like that I'm not going to talk too much about in this talk. And that's why if people want to talk more about it later, they can talk about it later. A corporate-like structure and practice. So the growth of an executive class that runs the university like a business and benefits from the various changes that are going on in the university while everyone else pays for it. And a focus on branding over making sure that it properly funds the services that it's supposed to provide, right? So it's less about quality education and more about its image, like, you know, Nike, right? And then finally, financialization. So, you know, the quote unquote justified, because I'm not saying it's actually justified, but they use this to justify. So justified by decreasing funding in the university, right? It pumps money into Wall Street investments to grow its endowment and it takes out huge loans from Wall Street for large construction projects. So we'll be, talking about Wall Street as well. So this is, like I said, the only part of the story admin ever wants to tell you about is that, over the course of 15 years or so, we could see that California went from funding education to defunding education while increasing funding for corrections, prisons. And so, there's very much like a swap, right? Like prisons are now funded at the, at the level that education used to be, and education is funded at at almost the level that prisons used to be. And so that's the part like I said, admin only wants to talk about this, and it is important to talk about, but it's not the full story by any means. So yes, we should be fighting for, millionaires tax and things like that. And we have in the past, when our union was more radical, or radical at all really, we did get involved in stuff like that. This should be part of the equation if we want to fight back, is, fighting for full funding. But it's, again, not the full picture. Another way to look at this is to see the changing funding source. So this dark blue line here is the student fees, and the gray line is the state funds. So you can see that over the years, it's gone from student fees were just a small percentage to, oh, this thing's in my way over here, but to it, by 2011, 2012, it was nearly 50-50. So, a big shift in the proportion of revenue, whether it's coming from the state or whether it's coming from student fees. And another way to look at this is the state budget. So, you can see that there was a decline, right? So up here, the blue, this is the UC. So the UC did have a decline in funding, but then, by 2013, we saw funding increasing back again. So we can see by, the most recent school year, 2019 to 2020, it looks like it was at least as big, if not as big, as 2008 to 2007. Which obviously doesn't count for increased student populations, but there has been significant increases back to the university over the years. But the decline was real. However, Reclaim UC, which if you haven't ever checked out their blog, absolutely go check it out. They are amazing. They've been around longer than I have, and have written on a wider variety of stuff and in more depth than I ever have. And so I just want to thank them. I don't even know who they are. They're all anonymous, but they're fantastic. So Reclaim UC's analysis of the budget shows that the increase in revenue from tuition and fees was actually higher than the decline in state funding between 2008 2013. So it's partly from fee increases, and also partly from increased proportions of non-resident students who pay the non-resident tuition. So, as much as they're talking about, we've been defunded and we're in a crisis, during the peak years of this supposed crisis, they actually grew their revenue, right? Because the revenue coming in from fees was greater than the money that they lost. And so that's important to know too. It's not that the money isn't there, right? They're getting the money, but they're still asking us to make the sacrifices, right? Us as students, us as workers. And so that's important to know. And there's a hyperlink here if you want to check out that specific analysis. So just how bad were the tuition hikes? So I started in 2011. I came right after some of the really big protests. And then 2011 itself was a pretty big year in some ways too, with Occupy and opposition to proposed tuition hikes, but I'll talk about that more in a bit. So tuition and fees actually tripled at the UC from 2001 to 2011. And unfortunately, you probably know this, but wages didn't also triple during that time, unfortunately. So you can imagine how this affected families and students, right? During this period, tuition in California rose at the fastest rate in the country. And despite what UC admin says, so this is one thing that they do, they say, Sacramento has defunded us, and that's why, we need to just raise tuition. because the higher that we raise tuition, we get more money from the rich students, and then we can give that money out as aid to lower income students. So really, those of you that are opposing tuition hikes, you just don't like low income students. And don't blame us for raising tuition. You should just blame Sacramento, right? But again, Reclaim UC has a blog post where they show that lower income students actually, even after all this stuff that they're supposedly doing to help low income students, they still left the UC with the higher amount of loans on average, higher than other students. So, it's bullshit. They don't actually care about low income students at the UC, which you all probably know anyways, but it's important, I think, to specifically address that, because that is a talking point that I've seen many times over the years. So they will concern troll however they need to, right? Say whatever they want to get people to try to oppose, to try to not be opposed to tuition hikes. So this here, I think, is a really good way of thinking about what we really mean when we say it shifted from a public good to a private consumer choice. So this is inflation adjusted dollars, right? So back in 1965, the UC cost under $2,000 in 2011 dollars, right? And by 2011, in 2011 dollars, it was costing over $11,000. So that is a huge increase for families, right? This is much more accessible back then, especially if you consider the fact that wages have stagnated for the average worker and have actually declined for low income workers, right? The value of the minimum wage has declined over the last few decades. So this is part of the reason why the UC's become so inaccessible and why students are taking out so much in loans, right? I mean, across the country, student loans are over $1.5 trillion, right? It's ridiculous. Something is, at some point, it's going to burst. It has to. So the UC admin has used austerity as an excuse to raise tuition and fees, to more than make up any funding gap under the cover of a crisis, and they continue to lie and cheat to do so. Back in 2017, the UC Office of the President reported to the regents that they would be short $88 million in the upcoming school year. So the UC regents voted to raise tuition for the first time since the 2011 tuition hike freeze to cover this deficit, right? So they said, we need $88 million. And so they said, fine, and they raised tuition. And that was the first time since pepper spray incident and everything, there had been a big tuition freeze because it had become politically impossible for them to raise tuition, right? Because there was so much outrage from students and from people in California. However, later that year, the UC Office of the President was, the whole UC was audited by the California State Auditor. And the Office of the President was found to be hiding, as in not reporting to the state as they're legally obligated to, $175 million. So this was more than double the quote unquote deficit that drove the tuition hike. And so I think it's important, right, to always ask, what are we doing with the money, right? You're claiming that there's a crisis and we all need to sacrifice, but yet the people at the top don't, and we always are. So again, it's important to look at more than just the state funding. And as I put here, I think I can safely say, I wish we wish we all could meme as well as undergrads. Because this is fantastic, right? When your mom asks where you put your $175 million in the Peloton, I was like, I love that. I had to include that because that was just so good. So not only did they not report that $175 million surplus to the state as they're supposed to, but also UC president at the time, Napolitano, was found to have interfered with the audit process. She told campuses not to say negative things about UCOP. And so to put that into a different perspective, as my tweet here put out at the time, if I filed my FAFSA the way that UCOP reported their budget, right, I'd be in trouble. If it was like, oh yeah, I forgot to mention the $175 million that I have in this other bank account. Whoops, thanks for the student aid, right? I'd be in a lot of trouble legally. And then if I tampered with my student evaluations, like how Napolitano tampered with campus evaluations in that audit, I'd probably be fired, right? So, you know, we really have to think about just how bad these actions were and how significant these things were that they did. And they got away with it. They absolutely got away with it. Nobody got in trouble for this at all. Napolitano continued to be president until just recently when she said she's stepping down to whatever. I don't know what she's doing. Everyone was afraid she was going to become vice president. I'm not sure Harris is any better, but anyways. Lack of funding or lack of priorities, right? So any analysis that only focuses on revenue misses some very important elements to this picture. We also need to ask, how is this money being spent? And unfortunately and unsurprisingly, the answer is another huge disappointment, right? They're not spending the money in the way that we all wish they would. So a big part of the story here is that over the last couple decades, we have seen this massive growth in administration to the point where there are now more senior managers than there are tenure track faculty. And for a university, you would think that they would have more teachers than senior managers. Yeah, I don't, people are always asking me like, what do these people do? And, you know, I don't have the resources to go through and look at all of the various job duties and everything and map all this out. So I can't really answer. But given my experience with a lot of these administrators, like Dean Gibling, who's, you know, he had been Dean of Graduate Studies for many, many, many years. And we were having a meeting about student housing one day, and people were really upset because they're trying to get rid of the only affordable student housing on campus that was, you know, mostly used by students with families. And he said, you know, it occurred to me one day, about a year ago, that housing is important for graduate students. So if it's anything like Dean Giblin, I think it's safe to say they're not doing very much. Right? And yeah, so, you know, let's take Davis, for example, because Davis is really bad. From 1993 to 2007, at universities nationally, the full-time admin per 100 students rose by around 40%, but at Davis, it rose by 318%. While at the same time at Davis, the number of full-time instructional, research, and service staff actually declined by 4.5%. So we end up with this situation where you have a lot of managers overseeing less workers. And, you know, managers aren't really the ones doing the work, right? So let's fund workers.
Hey, Duane.
Yeah.
Do you know if that includes the medical center?
It might. I got this information from someone else, so that it might include the medical centers. That is a good question.
I'm just like, not that it makes it better, but I'm sort of, my mind is sort of boggled by that discrepancy.
Yeah, yeah, and so I think also it probably it just might, but we should also note that one of the things that AFSCME was fighting for, because they represent the patient care workers, was safe staffing. They didn't have safe staffing levels at the medical centers either. So if this does include increased management in the medical centers, we basically have the same picture in the medical centers of unsafe numbers of patient care workers and other important workers. So, you know, I'm mostly talking about the educational side of things, but all this stuff really applies to the med centers as far as I know too. And if you want to know more about that, AFSCME has put out a lot over the years. They probably still have it up on their website. So here's the numbers per campus from 1993 to 2013. We can see the number of full-time executive and administrative and managerial staff has massively increased at every campus. It's absurd. Riverside looks like the one that was probably not as bad as all the other ones, maybe, but it's. Yeah, and again, some of this might be from the medical center, so maybe Riverside doesn't have a medical center. But this is something that we can see going on across the UC, and particularly Davis and Irvine during that time was probably the worst, it looks like. Then part of the way that they're spending their money that we should look at too is not just this growth in administration, but also executive pay. So these numbers, this number here is from a few years back. I'm not sure what it is right now, but a few years back, 2.6% of the workforce took 13% of the payroll, right? So it's really the people at the top are making a lot, and they're taking up a lot of the payroll revenue. It's not that we're all getting paid nicely, right? We all know that. Back in 2011, the top 225 paid executives, extra compensation, not their total pay, just the extra compensation, was $20 million. So that means if they kept their average salary being $335,000, right? They kept their normal salary and gave up just the extra compensation, we could have saved $20 million. And I think 335,000 is more than enough to get by. I somehow have managed to get, I think we all barely managed to get by on 20,000 a year. We would love to, just double that. So UCOP executive pay budget for 2016 to 17 was just over $300 million. And, UCOP is not doing any direct teaching or any direct research. It's just full of executives that are completely mismanaging the system. And so the same year that ASME workers had to go on strike to get a raise when UCOP was refusing to give them one, later that year, the UC Regents voted to give all the chancellors a raise up to 20%. And they said that their low pay was quote unquote an injustice, as you can see here from the San Francisco Gate, right? They actually called it an injustice. These people were all making at least $300,000 a year. And it was an injustice that they weren't making more. But yet ASME workers who do work that is absolutely essential to our university running, most of them are people of color, and the vast majority of them qualify for some kind of public assistance. And yet they weren't deserving of a raise, but it was an injustice, right, that these executives weren't paid more. This is the kind of university that we have. I haven't checked this in a couple of years, but I imagine it's still up. The Sacramento Bee had a website up. It used to be sacb.com/state pay, all one word. And you could look up the salaries of every single public employee. And so you could look at the University of California and look at, who's making how much money at the University of California. And we can see some of these people are making, over $1 million, over $500,000. It's absurd. And this is just the UCOP budget here, right? Why we need a private equity manager making $500,000 a year, I don't know. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's probably numerous sites out there that I always just used to go to SACB. But real quick, I thought of this last night and I was like, I gotta say, this is so funny. The comedian Hari Kondabolu has this joke where, he talks about, here's the list of people who will die in the revolution. And I can luckily say that the SACB has put together that list for me. No, I'm kidding. That's not actually a death threat. So spending priorities. So do they care about quality education? So with all this extra money coming in from students, is the administration at least properly funding quality education and important student services? No, right? We know it's all going to, administrative bloat and executive pay. So things like increasing class size and underfunded health services, homeless TAs, right? And more show a lack of concern about the funding, the education and services that students need. Does anyone, I had to throw this in here, does anyone know what this is? Has anyone seen this before? You can either chat it or just jump in with your voice. Yes, I hate it. Anyone else? Have you seen this before, anyone? No? So at some point a few years back, the years are especially under the quarantine, I don't remember what year anything was anymore. But a few years back, the UC was like, we want to change our logo and look more hip or something. And so they they released this, and it was the laughingstock of the entire state for a little while, where some people said it looks like it's loading and it's kind of frozen, and other people have said kind of looks like a toilet bowl. But I think this is sort of like the, to me, it is like one of the examples of like, you know, it looks like a shitty corporate logo to me, right? It's like, this is what our shitty corporate university has come to, is it looks like this now. Anyways, so class size. One important way that we can think about class size is what is the ratio of grad students to undergrads, right? If you are seeing changes in that ratio, that might indicate that you've got increasing or decreasing class sizes. And so back when I was on the bargaining team in 2013 to 14, we released this report called Towards Mediocrity, Administrative Mismanagement and the Decline of UC Education. And this is from that report. Graduate enrollment from 1970 to 2000 grew at less than 1/10 the rate of undergraduate enrollment in relation to their counterparts at comparable schools. Graduate enrollees at the UC now constitute a significantly smaller percentage of total enrollees. So even just my time at the, within the first few years that I was at Davis, we saw upper division classes go from being capped of 1 TA to 80 students to 1 TA to 95 students. And I've heard very similar stories in other departments and other universities in my time. When I was on the bargaining team back in 2013 to 14, we had an undergrad from Berkeley. We had a bargaining session at Berkeley. Well, we had numerous, but at this one particular one, this undergrad from Berkeley came to support our bargaining demand over class size, right? We wanted to be able to bargain over class size because a lot of us felt the class sizes were just too damn high. And one undergrad said, that they were a transfer student, that they had come from the community college system where the classes were really small and you get to know the professor and the professor gets to know you. And then they came to the UC and they don't know their professor. The professor definitely doesn't know who they are. And then they said that, I was walking around and I saw the construction for the new football stadium and I thought it was a classroom. And I think that's a feeling that a lot of students and a lot of us as teachers feel as well, right? That class size has just gotten to be too high at the university and that it is an issue of quality teaching. And so one of the things that was said to us during bargaining by someone who's actually, I think he was a provost or something at UCLA. He was on their bargaining team for a little bit. He said to us, "It sounds like you're insinuating that class size affects teaching." And we're like, yeah, no shit, yes, we're not insinuating it. We're very much explicitly saying that. But they refuse to believe that, that you can have a very different type of pedagogy with, a class of 15 than a class of 40, right? And we all know that obviously class size does drastically affect teaching. And as somebody who's now, at the time I'd only TA, now that I've taught my own course, and I've done classes of 150, right, lecturing, it's completely different, right? It feels like I'm looking at a Where's Waldo, as opposed to when I'm TAing and I have small classes, or the couple times I've gotten to teach and I have a class capped at 50. It's night and day, completely different. So things like student services are also haven't been properly funded. So one example, a lot of my stuff's kind of UC Davis centered because I usually do this for UC Davis students, is things like mental health services, right? So some years ago, there was some reporting and some students involved in advocating for better mental health services. There was this issue where they found out that there was this audit and it reported that the numbers of staff on campus, mental health staff, had been inflated to misrepresent the actual number. And so they had gotten $250,000 to try to increase the number of people there to, mental health providers, right, counseling services and stuff. And, they found that actually, again, the UC was fudging the numbers and lying about that, and they'd actually misspent the money in ways that they weren't supposed to, right? And because they had been given the money in a non-binding way, and so they were like, great, we don't have to spend it this way, and so they didn't. And so, you know, this is just one example of, like I said, there's a lot I'm sure you all can talk about from your various campuses and other stuff, but just wanted to give like one example here of the ways in which students are paying for more, but they're not getting the services that they need. How am I doing on time? Okay. So it's important, I think, to examine both the pressure that Wall Street exerts on the university and how the UC invests its money into Wall Street as a source of revenue. And so I want to talk about that for a little bit too. So at some point in the last couple of decades, the UC's been invested in all the following things. And it's only divested from some of them after years of student protests. So it's not necessarily invested in all of this now, but the UC has been invested in all of this. So private prisons. The UC was invested in private prisons and in banks that invest in private prisons, which we all know, you know, the US prison system is a system of racial control that disproportionately impacts Black and Latino people. And the UC was profiting off of that and bringing in money from that, right? And if we're trying to fight for our students, that means not just thinking of our students as people in our classroom, but as people from various communities, right? And so I don't think that the place that I work should be a place that is making money off of companies and practices that are, you know, exploiting their community, destroying their community, killing people in their community, ruining their community's health, right? So, you know, we're trying to imagine a different kind of university, I think a lot of us. The UC has and still is invested in the occupation of Palestine, despite the majority of undergrad student governments calling on it to divest for years now. Despite years of protests, we've had occupations of buildings at UC Davis for Palestine, and still they absolutely refuse to defund. It seems to be a non-negotiable issue for them. But this includes companies like G4S, which is involved in prisons and no trial, you know, people being put away without trial, prisons where there's torture, prisons where children are incarcerated, as well as managing checkpoints at the apartheid wall. They've been invested in Veolia, which runs segregated bus lines and train lines in the West Bank. And they've been invested in Caterpillar, which bulldozes, you know, produces bulldozers specifically for Israel to illegally destroy homes and to make illegal settlements, right? To, you know, displace Palestinians and engage in ethnic cleansing, basically. And UC money is going toward that, right? And then we have corporate banks like Wells Fargo, which invests in private prisons, Bank of America, which bought up Countrywide some years ago, both of which have been involved in subprime mortgages. And so, you know, to think back in 2008 and into the, you know, the big economic crash there. Let me see what this is. Oh, cool. Okay, G4S is no longer in Palestine. That's good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so like I said, these were things that have over the years, some of this may have changed. Yeah, so we know that, yeah, where was I? Oh yeah, so UC money's been in banks that were part of the predatory lending, you know, the subprime mortgages, which we know that Black Americans were 2 times more likely to be subprime lenders. Lendees, you know, yeah, to take, sorry, I'm like blanking on what the word here is there, to receive subprime mortgages. And in California, Latinos were 2/3 of the people who received subprime mortgages. And so, you know, what we saw, borrowers, yeah, thank you. I'm like, and so what we saw from the Great Recession and from, you know, these predatory practices was that, you know, a lot of people lost their homes. But there was also this big increase in the wealth gap, and we had seen for a few decades that the wealth gap was slightly declining in this country, and the Great Recession made it worse again. And so it wasn't, it's not, it's just another way in which racial capitalism is sort of like stealing from communities to make the rich even richer. And so that's, something else that, again, if we care about our students and the communities that they're from, as well as us, right, the communities that we're from, that, this is something that, we should be pushing the university to be like, hey, you shouldn't be making the world worse and making money off of it. Again, fossil fuel companies, which we know have been involved in extractive economies, plundering indigenous lands, right? No DAPL is sort of the biggest, most recent thing I think that people have been paying attention to, but there's, a lot of that going on all over the place. Thank you, Connor. Fossil fuel companies, we know, have been a huge part of climate change, which will and already is disproportionately affecting the poorest people in the global south, right? Creating environmental refugees. Fossil fuel companies, right, and environmental racism, so the disproportionate negative health effects of pollution on communities of color, and the sort of contradiction of it all, that the UC is saying that the state of California should increase funding, to us, right? That the problem is that Sacramento doesn't want to pay us the amount of money that they should, right? They should fund us properly. But yet the UC has money in fossil fuel companies, which lobbied as hard as they could and did everything, had big public, campaigns against the gas tax a few years back, right, which would have raised money for education. So you had UC money going into these companies, which was then saying, being used politically to oppose raises for funding in education, right? And so, it's just completely absurd that the UC's invested. And this is just a small example of the many different ways in which UC money and Wall Street are really, messing up the communities that we come from and our students come from, and, the world really. Why is this not going? There we go. So a few years back, to try to connect it all up, because that's something I always try to do. I think it's important to talk about the connections between what might seem like disparate issues, is to show that actually all this is connected, and we could, sort of unite people that are working on these different issues. So I came up with this flyer here that says, University of California endowment money goes toward companies demolishing the homes, demolishing homes in Palestine and profiting off of the occupation of Palestinian land. Private for-profit prisons that rip apart families and communities and lobby for tough on crime bills that target poor communities and communities of color. And fossil fuel companies ranking in billions while creating climate change whose effects create environmental refugees around the globe. And then imagine if that money went toward affordable housing instead, right? So this was at the same time that we had people that were trying to push for separately a lot of the time, right? Some people were only involved in divestment around one of these issues. We also had some people that were just involved in housing, right? Fighting for affordable housing. And so I was trying to say, hey, look, like, we're putting all this money into pushing people out of their homes. Why can't we invest it back into here instead and put it into affordable housing? And so, this is the kinds of things that I try to do, and I think make for stronger movements, is when people think that their issue is just sort of the single thing here, and they don't necessarily realize the connections it has to all these other things that people are fighting for. And so once you show people that, hey, we're all sort of fighting for different manifestations of against different manifestations of the system, we all really care about justice, it's easier to connect the dots. And so the last part I want to talk about with Wall Street is its pressure on the university. And so a big part of how the UC operates is through borrowing money, particularly for capital intensive projects like construction. They love their construction. We're always getting new things. Like we have a new welcome center. Like, why do we need a welcome center with a $300,000 touchscreen wall? Beats me. But they're spending a lot of money on construction, and part of how they fund that is through taking out big loans through Wall Street at low interest rates. But back in 2014, Moody's downgraded the UC from an AA1 to an AA2, and they gave a rationale as to why they did that. And I think this really speaks to the pressure that Wall Street exerts on the university, which, you know, I think the university would be doing this stuff on their own anyways, but it's just added pressure onto them. So they say the downgrade of AA2 to AA2 reflects the university's multiple years of operating deficits, rising fixed costs, and revenue constraints. The rating also incorporates the university's substantial and growing debt burden, increasing the importance of stronger cash flow to absorb rising debt service obligations. The university's ability to improve operations will be further limited by public policy and faculty and staff that is 40% unionized. Then it lists challenges, and it says challenges: political and public scrutiny of the rising cost of higher education will constrain UC's ability to grow net tuition revenue. So what does that mean? It means to get cheaper loans, UC admin needs to have unchecked power, right? You know, unchecked by, you know, their 40% unionized workers who might not be able to just, right, that they can't just cut their costs, meaning they can't just get rid of your benefits. They can't just cut your salary because they have a contract, right? Because we all have contracts. And so that is seen as a bad thing. And so that's part of why they're downgraded. And what do they mean by public scrutiny? They mean things like student, you know, protests against tuition hikes and the public who support them. And so, right, that they can't just raise tuition wherever they want because it was becoming politically very difficult to do that. After, you know, lots of students had done things, you know, protests and building occupations and sit-ins and lots of other things. And so, you know, basically the more power that we have to hold them accountable, the worse the situation is, according to Wall Street, right? And so Wall Street is telling them that UC admin basically needs to have completely unchecked power, and that workers should be ununionized and students should just shut up and deal with it. And so this, you know, says, well, how has UC admin responded to student protests? And this is where I get into UCOP. So back in 2009 and 10, they voted for a tuition increase of 32%. These are the Occupy Everything days, right? This is before Occupy Wall Street. Students were taking over buildings all over the university. You know, all the various campuses were having occupations and things. At Davis, 52 people, it was 51 students and one professor, ended up staying at our administration building, Marac Hall. There was a lot of people there, but then the police showed up, and 52 of them said, we're gonna stay. We're not gonna leave, we're not scared. We're not gonna let them intimidate us. And so they stayed, and the police came in middle of the night, dressed in full riot gear, and arrested everybody. And yeah, there's links to videos. I'm not gonna, I usually, if I'm doing like the history stuff, I try to show all the videos. I'm not gonna show all the videos. And they arrested the 52 people. And they were facing charges, and they only had the charges dropped after, in response, other students then retook and reoccupied the building and said, drop the charges. And then later, another example from UC Davis is students tried to march to the highway, the 80, to sort of shut that down, like we've been seeing more recently in Black Lives Matter protests, where people march and try to take over the highway. So students tried to do that, and they were met with UCPD as well as Davis and CHP and possibly other police forces as well. And there was a big line of cops, and I'm not going to show the video, I'll just describe a little bit of it, that was the most Davis thing ever. If any of you have ever been to Davis, you know they make a big deal about how bike friendly we are. We've got the Bicycle Hall of Fame. There's bikes everywhere. So students did the most Davis thing ever, which was it's so cute and funny, but really smart. They formed what they call a bicycle barricade. So the front line of the march, everyone had the bicycles in front of them like giant shields, and they marched up to the police, and they actually broke their way through the police line, and continued to try to march to the highway. The police pulled back. They were shooting pepper balls at everybody. And then again, they had another confrontation with the police. And what the police ended up doing was they grabbed an undergraduate who was sort of identified as like a student protest leader. They grabbed her and arrested her, threw her in the back of the car. And then there was a big standoff, and they basically said, "We'll release her if you turn around." And there was this long negotiation, and they were basically saying, if you continue to try to march to the highway, which they probably would have been successful if they had kept trying, she will face potential suspension or expulsion. She might face criminal charges. So if you don't want her to face that, turn around. And so they ended up doing that, so she would be released. But this is how police have responded to student protests, right? To arrest us, shoot pepper balls at us, and things like that. Oh, police used the bike tactic. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, it was literally a hostage negotiation. God damn, they took our tactic. Well, that sucks. I'm not going to show this video. I'm not going to show all the videos. I particularly right now, I don't think people want to see videos of potential police violence. But at a regents meeting, so one of the things that we were doing once the student movement got to a point where you had coordination going on between campuses, and this is, as graduate students, I think this is a role that I've seen us play, and I think there's really two big roles that we can play to support undergraduate organizing. One is as institutional memory, right? We're around a lot longer than they are, so we can tell them these histories. And two is, or at least at the time when our union was good, we could play the role of helping coordinate between campuses. And so, these, yeah, and yep, they are still doing a lot of this stuff. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just talking about some stuff, but I really hope we can talk more about some of the history of the student movement and labor struggles in our discussion. But yeah, so one of the things that we can help do is when they're disconnected, when they're students at Davis don't necessarily know students at Santa Cruz and LA and in Irvine and things like that, right? That as graduate students, usually through the union historically, but now I don't know so much. But that was something, a role that we played, was helping connect this together and helping them have a coordinated statewide movement. And so we were every time there was a regents meeting, we were going and trying to shut it down. And we knew numerous times we were successful in shutting down regents meetings. And so what happened was there was this regents meeting at UCSF, and students were locked out of the building, and they found that there was this back way in through this parking garage. And there was this one lone UCPD officer there who was trying to keep the crowd back. And he twice, and it's caught on camera, pulls his gun and points it at the students. It was completely denied that happened. It was just students are making this up. He didn't do it. And then the video came out and they were like, oh, whoops, we'll have to do something about that. So yeah, this is how they respond to us. And most infamously, if you're into meme culture, this is the most memed one. In 2011 to 2012, when the Occupy movement sprang up, there were Occupy encampments at a lot of campuses across the UC, and it started out. I don't know the history of all the different campuses, but there was an Occupy Cal that happened before Occupy UC Davis. And at Occupy Cal, they put up tents in this one, public grassy area, and UCPD was sent in right away to take the tents down and, deal with the students. And students, there's videos here of all this, but I'm not going to show the videos. Students stood and they like linked arms, right? They just stood and they linked arms around the tents. And UCPD's response was to take out their batons and just start slamming people in the chest with their batons. Also, they could get to the tents to take the tents down because, threatening tents would, completely destroy the campus, and who can learn when there's a tent outside, right? I don't know. So it was really, really egregious. It was caught on video, and that ended up making national news. Stephen Colbert had a thing about it, I believe. It was really talked about. And so then the chancellor at the time of Berkeley came out and said that the students linking arms were, and this is a quote, not nonviolent. That standing there, having your arms interlinked was basically violent, right? If double negatives is a thing. He was saying that them standing still with their arms interlinked was them being violent. And so that's the kind of, response that we've had from administration and from the police. And so that was on November 9th, 2018. November 9th, 2011. And then on November 18th, 2011, Occupy UC Davis had sprung up, and we had put some tents out, and UCPD came by. There was at least 50 of them. They were dressed in full riot gear, and they came out on the bullhorn and they said, tents have to go down and you have to disperse. And we're like, no, we're not going to do that. And then students, much like Berkeley, but in much fewer numbers, in this area here, they put all the tents into this little circle here, this stone circle, or concrete, whatever it is, and then they just stood with their arms interlinked, much like at Berkeley. And so part of what the UC Davis protest was about the Occupy stuff, but it was also about this proposed, it wasn't publicly released yet, but we heard from, like, I think one of the student regents that they're considering an 81% tuition hike over 4 years. And we were very, very upset about what had just happened at Berkeley 9 days earlier. And so it was about police brutality, it was about tuition hikes, it was about all the stuff that Occupy Wall Street was about. And so they stood around here with their arms interlinked, protecting their tents. And the police came in, they grabbed some students, threw them to the ground, zip tied them, and they took down the tents. There was a large number of students that were standing around sort of watching, because it was a big spectacle and there was a big standoff for a while before anything happened. And so then students sat down, partially blocking, but not fully blocking the way, between the police with the people that they had arrested, and the police car, which was around over here. And so that's where, if you haven't seen it yet, again, I'm not going to show it, but you can see the video of the infamous pepper spray moment when Lieutenant Pike stepped over. Sorry, I always get a little. Yeah, I was on the quad that day. I didn't get pepper sprayed because my eight-year-old son at the time was out there with me, and I was like, I probably shouldn't go get beat up by cops in front of my kid. So yeah, I got to watch as he applied, military grade chemical weapons against seated protesters, yeah. So that if you haven't seen, there's memes of pepper spraying everything, right? That was met with global news coverage and outrage. But the part of the story that doesn't get told, because what gets focused on is that particular act of police brutality. And I think the part that is really the most important to know is that after, sorry, I was tear up talking about this. After they pepper sprayed students, like I said, there was a huge crowd of people that maybe had been part of Occupy, some of them, but they didn't want to like stand and face the police. And there was a lot of students that were like walking by, because it was like midday on a Friday, right? A lot of students walking by on the quad that stopped. There were students in the MU eating who came out because they're eating their lunch and they saw what was going on. So there was this huge crowd that had gathered, many times bigger. This isn't a picture of that. Many times bigger than the number of students that were actually blocking the tents. And once everyone got pepper sprayed, there was no separation anymore between protesters and observers. Everyone was pissed. And so you had everybody rushed the police, and there was this huge standoff where the police slowly backed up toward the police car, with hundreds of angry students chanting at them and yelling at them. And we kicked them off the quad that day, and we started chanting, "Whose quad? Our quad." And it was amazing that, like, this terrible act of violence had happened, but the solidarity that was shown right after, and the power that we all realized that we had, we retook that public space. Tents went back up right away. It became international news. And then a few days later, we had, this is a picture, an aerial picture of the next Occupy General Assembly that we had at Davis. That Monday, 5,000 people, it's estimated, showed up for that General Assembly. And yet Katehi still wasn't fired or didn't step down until many years later for other stuff. But we really have power as, as aside from the power that we have as workers to sort of stop working and shut the machine down, we just also have great numeric power. So yeah, these are some of the videos. And lastly, so after it became politically impossible for them to do that kind of spectacle of violence against students, right? Because it was just, like I said, there was outrage. And the fact that Katehi didn't get fired or immediately have to step down, didn't mean that she was completely immune to the effects of that outrage. It just meant that she had to, like, walk on eggshells. And so people knew this. And so we retook the quad, we retook buildings, and occupations and things of buildings happened for a while. Christmas break, winter break happened. In the winter quarter, some people were like, hey, there's this US bank in our Memorial Union. Let's talk about the privatization of the university and how banks are giving out student loans, and let's talk about all this connection. Let's shut down this bank. And to really sum it up really quickly, there's a lot more to it. Oh yeah, thanks, Ellie. So, oops. So every day for about a month, they sat down and blocked the door to that U.S. bank inside of the Student Memorial Union. And eventually the US Bank branch closed. And the UC got this note from US Bank saying essentially that the UC hadn't fulfilled its contract by ensuring that they could do business. They said that the UC in the past had used available means to disperse crowds, and that they should have done so again. And this is important to remember, that this is just a few months after the pepper spray, right? So they're saying, you pepper sprayed students before, why couldn't you do that again, essentially, right? You've used force on students, why didn't you do that again? And so in order to not be sued for a breach of contract, the university gave up the names of 12 people. There was at least 30, maybe more, people who were involved in these sit-ins, and the UC just took names of 12 of them that they knew, 11 students and one professor. And they gave it to the DA. And then they said, look, no, we're doing what we can. And also they wouldn't get sued by US Bank. And so then the Yolo County DA charged these people with initially the charges were that they were facing was up to 10 years in prison and $1 million in quote unquote damages from the loss of income that US Bank was facing, right? And so what we've seen is that the UC administration will use great interpersonal violence when they can, and when they can't, they will use other means to crush student protest and to ruin people's lives. Being pepper sprayed sucks, um, but I'm sure it's not nearly as bad as potentially facing 10 years in prison, right? The Davis dozen ended up getting off with just community service. But, I want to be clear here that, the UC was still engaging in an act of violence here against these people, and probably even more so, because this really would have ruined people's lives to be put away for that long potentially. And so yeah, so all this really comes down to is, what kind of university do we want? What kind of university do we have? The neoliberalization of the UC has seen this sort of corporatization of the university, right? It's run more like a corporation. It looks like a corporation. It acts like a corporation. And this growth of this class of executives who benefit from this new model, and they have the power to keep pushing it further. And they don't hesitate to use violence to keep that power. So the violence off campus, whether it's the colonial occupation and extraction, the environmental degradation and mass incarceration that the UC is or has been invested in, is very much connected to the violence on campus, right? That again, to go back to the sort of the David Harvey argument here, right? That this is about capital accumulation and class power. And these white supremacist colonial projects and this project of capital accumulation is one that is intrinsically violent, and is held together with violence, all over the place, and including on our campus. And as we fight the UC, we should expect, not be surprised when this happens again, and it will happen again. And that this is just a mirror of the society itself that we live in, right? That ultimately, if we want a better and a different university, we're going to have to fight for a better and a different world, because our world is one that is held together through these forms of violence. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah, so I'm going to end it there. Does somebody else want to